Now, to something we also saw when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, leading the Liberals. Now, as you remember, old-time Liberals couldn't stand Turnbull dragging his party to the left. And now it's the Morrison government that's way down in the polls. And it's got the Prime Minister now demanding global warming policies that are even more radical than what Malcolm Turnbull tried to force on the Liberals. Now, I'm not saying the government's definitely going to lose the next election. I mean, it probably will, but, you know, there is freedom now coming after all these lockdowns and shut borders, and maybe you'll benefit from some of the, you know, optimism. But it is in deep strife. And, well, let me just ask you, what would be the legacy of the Morrison government, do you think? Apart from this record debt. Personally, I'd give it a tick for responding to the China threat, trying now to rush in better weapons, for forming more alliances to defend ourselves, and for pushing for more free speech at universities. I like that a lot. But other than that, I mean, my mind goes blank. The government's going to leave behind very shallow cultural footprints. And this has really upset a lot of long-time Liberal supporters who are looking for alternatives again, or so it seems. I mean, since the election, news polls shows support for minor political parties, apart from the Greens and One Nation, that's nearly doubled to 13%. Much as we saw under Malcolm Turnbull, who really ticked off the Conservative base. He did it worse, but this is trending in the wrong direction for the Liberals. Now, one of those minor parties that is rising, it's the Liberal Democrats. Now, they've already got 2 MPs in the Victorian Parliament. You heard from one last night. And they've since attracted high-profile recruits like former federal Liberal MP Ross Cameron and former Liberal campaigner John Riddick, who is now the party's New South Wales Senate candidate, despite once writing a book called How to Make the Liberals Great Again, a job that Riddick has now apparently given up as hopeless. Anyway, tonight I've invited 2 other Liberal Democrats, also former Liberals, to tell us why they think the Liberals are no longer the answer. Joining me is Campbell Newman, former LNP Premier of Queensland, now running for the Senate in Queensland for the Liberal Democrats. And also joining me is one of the party's newest members, Tom Switzer, a former Liberal advisor to then Liberal leader Brendan Nelson, who's also a former editor of The Spectator Australia, which I recommend you buy, subscribe, whatever it takes. Tom, the former Brendan Nelson guru, Eminence Greece. Can you tell me why you've now abandoned the Liberals as well? And I'll ask both of you, by the way, to name the 2 Liberal policies or non-policies that have bothered you most. You start first, Tom.
Well, I've never really been a member of the Liberal Party, but I generally vote Liberal at federal elections since I was eligible in the early 1990s. And I think, Andrew, the cold hard reality is that the Liberal Party has lost its bearings, and in an increasingly fragmented political environment, it could lose votes on its right flanks. And I think the Prime Minister should be aware of the great Margaret Thatcher's dictum, which I've used before, which is that standing in the middle of the road is very dangerous because you get knocked down by traffic from both sides. And that's the real danger now. That's the real danger now for Scott Morrison. We've seen this in Canada recently when the Tories try to be Trudeau-light. We saw this in Germany recently with the Christian Democrats trying to outflank the Social Democrats on the left. They suffered recently their worst electoral performance. And of course, you mentioned Malcolm Turnbull earlier. He was a disaster as a Liberal leader twice in 2008, 2009.
Same
and then,
thing.
of course, when he was Prime Minister, same thing. So I think the key point here is that the Liberal Party should be the custodian of the centre-right tradition, and it's failing to be that way.
Look, Campbell Newman, sorry, I should actually say that it's John Ruddick, not Riddick. I had it right the first time, wrong the second. Campbell Newman, tell me what you think are the 2 Liberal policies or non-policies that have bothered you the most.
Well, I wouldn't put them down as policies, Andrew, but in terms of 2 immediate issues, one is net zero by 2050, which has been coming a while. You could see that in the water. The other one has been
absolutely.
the abandonment of democracy and free speech and free expression during COVID. And what this Prime Minister and this Treasurer have done is they've stood back and watched draconian, odious handling of the pandemic by state premiers and territory first ministers and never called them out on it. So the big issue, though, is a cultural one. And it's that the Liberal Party was meant to stand, and this is what Menzies in his 1942 Forgotten People radio address talked about. It was meant to be for the middle class. It was about small government, personal responsibility, self-reliance, people being able to get ahead, live their lives with minimal government interference. This government is a corporatist government. It's about big government. It's about big business in the top end of town. It's about big unions. It's about government supposedly has the answers and it will intervene. And right now, they're trying to put out this complete baloney that somehow they know how to manage the Australian economy through to 2050. And don't worry, the modelling says everything's fine. Well, it's BS.
I know, and again,
the first
exactly
order
your point
from
too,
a
Campbell.
government who couldn't even roll out vaccines. A government that couldn't even roll out vaccines fast enough.
Very good point. But again, your point about the big corporate state. Big business now getting in bed with the government on that particular issue. Earlier in the pandemic, they called in the ACTU to help advise it. I mean, fair dinkum. But look, I want to get Tom Switzer. Campbell mentioned global warming a couple of times there. Now, we got to know each other when I admired what you were doing, almost single-handedly, it seemed to me, you and Brendan Nelson, trying to fight against the whole global warming push that was being, orchestrated by Malcolm Turnbull before, as he tried to stab his way to the leadership of the first time. You did that. It must really gall you to see the Liberals giving in to what you try to fight.
Well, from a political perspective, you're right. I mean, by signing up to net zero emissions by 2050, Morrison is essentially conceding that Labor was right all along on climate and energy policy. And remember, Tony Abbott defeated not just Kevin Rudd's emissions trading scheme in 2010, Julia Gillard's carbon tax in 2013 and 2014, and indeed Scott Morrison won the shock election in 2019 by reminding voters that renewables, the whole process of decarbonising the economy is not a cost-free exercise. Now, in fairness, I think the political and the business climate has changed, and it's largely because of these capital markets and financial institutions around the Western world. They are, we're told, discriminating heavily in favour of renewables. But remember, the technological solutions for the battery backup for wind and solar, they're not yet proven commercially. No, and what about international investors right now? How are they looking at the Europe of today with soaring energy prices, a severe energy shortage, and a mad scramble back to baseload power, Andrew?
It is so true. It is so true. And by the way, I have not seen these costs quantified, whether the costs of international capital, if we don't sign up, is going to be greater than the costs of signing up. Where's the cost-benefit analysis? But Campbell, this is so frustrating. I pointed just then to a fight that Tom Switzer was having way back with the Liberals. They won it then and paved the way to an election win for Tony Abbott. All that seems to be thrown away. Why have the Liberals changed in your experience?
Well, because it's a poll-driven government. And it's a poll-driven Prime Minister who fundamentally doesn't believe in stuff. Let me give you a quick example of how fraudulent the position is. The Prime Minister does one good thing, which is the AUKUS alliance, the new deal, foreign defence deal. He then announces submarines, which are going to be nuclear, but almost in the same breath, he rushes to say they won't be endorsing a domestic nuclear power industry. Within only a matter of days.
What was that?
He's then talking about net zero.
What was that?
Well, he immediately, well, exactly, but here's the point. He's immediately then going to net zero by 2050. If he was fair dinkum about net zero by 2050, he would be endorsing wholeheartedly to be consistent with that policy, a domestic nuclear power industry. And if he says, oh, the numbers don't stack up, well, it's very easy, Prime Minister. Simply remove the ban. That's the key here. Remove the ban in legislation.
That's all. That's all.
The private sector deliver packaged nuclear reactors.
If it doesn't stack up, no one will invest.
But
exactly.
There's another issue here too, guys.
But Tom, that is a perfect example. You comment on that one, because for me it was a no-brainer. You've already got the nuclear subs. It was well received. Why not go the whole hog and say, listen, and we've got no objection to nuclear power. We may not build it ourselves,
Andrew,
but why ban obviously
to complete the point?
Solution, Tom, what do you reckon?
It's about polling.
No, just to Tom
first. Andrew, you've made this point before on this program. There's a troika of interest here. Big government, big media, including News Corp, a lot of our friends at News Corp, and of course, big business, big industry. But a confident Prime Minister, a confident Liberal Prime Minister would not be intimidated by this campaign. He would say that Australia, and you and I might disagree on this one, Andrew, but far from being a climate laggard, as we're all too often told, we are doing more than our fair share to reduce our carbon.
Exactly.
I mean, renewables account for something like 15% of our energy mix. The global average is about 4%. 1 in 4 Australian households have rooftop solar. It's a world record. And meanwhile, you've got Germany reinvesting in coal-fired power stations. China is chugging along the smoky path to prosperity. The non-OECD accounts for 65% of global emissions. Nothing at Glasgow will change their trajectory. A confident leader would protect Australian industry and workers, but Morrison's just gone to water.
Well, I would go further, and Tom, and say this, that Scott Morrison, and it's not just him, it's the Liberal Party generally. You look at Victoria, for heaven's sake, they've lost the confidence, or maybe it's the ability, to actually argue for something they believe in against the odds and try to change the public's mind, like John Howard used to do. This government doesn't do it. As Campbell said, looks at the polls and just goes with that. But Campbell, just finally, this question to you. Why not stay within the party and try to change it from within? That was the criticism of you by Tony Abbott. Not that he had much luck changing the party. Why not stay within the party?
Well, you sort of answered the question, but you referred to the book that was pulled together before by Alan Jones's producer, Jake Thrupp, which I'd encourage people to go and get. He asked me to write a chapter. I sat down and wrote a chapter about what was wrong with the Liberal Party and what the Liberal Party should actually be doing and standing for, particularly for small business. By the time I'd finished that, I realised there was no hope. And by the way, I was on the state executive of the LNP at the time, and it was made very clear to me by people like Peter Dutton, David Littleproud, Jared Blay and Tim Mander for state MPs, and the national president. They all voted against me being there. So my time was very limited. It was clear I wasn't wanted. They didn't want my views. I've gone to a party like Tom that actually stands up for small business, for small government, for balanced budgets, low debt, who actually believe in people being able to live their own lives. That self-reliance thing, the personal responsibility, it's where the Liberal Party should be, but they ain't, mate, and they're never going to with people like the MPs they've got there today from the political class.
Well, I want to thank you both, because it's often said, I mean, I think Malcolm Turnbull's people were saying it at the time, where are the Conservatives going to go anyway? You know, we can afford to tack that way. Where are they going? What's the alternative? I thank you both for giving Conservatives an alternative. Thank you so much, Tom Switzer, Campbell Newman.